Ok, teste.
Thank you.
Testing. 1, 2, 3.
Yes. Oh, so I have to present it. But my profession. Oh, and this is the instruction of opportunity. Yeah, it's a commercial organization, but we have to do the for I got language from to from to family. But which branch of the people? Yeah. So I thought this was just it's cool. Yeah, so this working. I'm trying to work on that. Now that I don't
Já entregou, abri para projetar. Isso aqui, né?
I'm trying to remember. Difficult. Ella, Ella, Ella. When I told you Ella, it's hard in my language. There's a name Ella. 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 Ella, just. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's very complicated. I'm so trying to I'm sorry, just a quick question. Does anybody know the etymology of the word pesquisar in Portuguese? What the etymology is? Etymology, where the word come from, pesquisar? Because it's so different from other. How? Pues como estudiar, pues, pero pesquisar no. I'm thinking about like pescar, pero eso no es pescar, no. But I will have a look. I thought that you made me know. Maybe from Latin. I don't know.
Okay, I finally got it.
Oh, yes. Esquissa. Esquissa. Perquisitum. So this is a Latin word, perquisitum of the Latin of the Latin language. It comes directly from Latin, pesquisa. Okay, so maybe we can start. I hope that yesterday you were okay with so much theory and so much like talking around grammaticalization from the theoretical framework of reanalysis and analogy. So today I wanted to focus on different things, maybe just to make it more interesting and not so boring. So, okay, please, just the next slide. Okay, so we kind of touched upon a couple of the mechanisms yesterday. I mean, we talked about reanalysis, we talked about analogy. We also mentioned the semantic bleaching, yeah? We also talked a little bit about morphological reduction. I mentioned the decategorialization, obligatorification, and to some extent, I talked about paradigmatization. But I would like to kind of repeat what I said very briefly to kind of know that we are on the same side in terms of understanding what those things are. So please, the next slide. Excuse me, can I have the next slide? Okay, so the process of semantic bleaching, this is a process where some word is losing some specific lexical meaning, right? And it develops somehow more general, more abstract, and in many cases, grammatical function. Yeah, this is what the semantic bleaching was. So we kind of have in this process loss of descriptive content, yes? There is some retaining of some functional, some schematic meaning. And generally, it's said that semantic bleaching is the first step in grammaticalization. It's one of the first steps of grammaticalization. But it's not always the case. Semantic bleaching can also occur a little bit later in the grammaticalization, but it's definitely not the last step. It's at the initial stages. We talk about semantic bleaching. So some examples here. So for instance, from Old English, the verb villan, which was the lexical term, yeah, that gave rise to the modal auxiliary will. I will go, but it comes from I will instead in the meaning of I want, yeah, I desire, yeah, I intend. We kind of saw this example with abere yesterday, but in English the same thing happened with the verb avoir, so to have, right? And this avoir or avere in Latin, it gave rise to this perfect auxiliary, such as, for instance, il a chanté, right? So you kind of have, so what is interesting is that you have this possessive meaning of to have, yeah, to possess, to have, and it gives rise to this perfect auxiliary, yeah? So this is the kind of idea of this semantic bleaching that we talked yesterday about. Yeah, we kind of have this lose of the specific meaning, the meaning of possession, to become something much more general. Yeah. I also found some examples in Quechua. So, for instance, in Quechua, the verb ri, yeah, originally meant to go. It gave rise to future auxiliaries as well. So something similar to what we see in the development of English will and the Quechua ri, in a sense. Or what we saw yesterday, maybe, be going to. So this kind of direction, motion verb, yeah? So in this sense, you can kind of see that some grammatical paths across languages are similar, yeah? Okay, next slide. Then we talked yesterday about this morphological reduction, which can also be called erosion. And you can talk about two different levels. One is morphological one. The other one that we mentioned yesterday is the phonological one. Yeah, we have some kind of phonetic or morphological shortening of a word during the process of grammaticalization. And that process often accompanies semantic bleaching, you know? So we have some loss of phonological material in terms of those processes that I talked to you yesterday about, yeah? We have the creation of clitic affixes and some reduced forms of auxiliaries. And what we said as well, the result is independent noun becoming a much more bound forms. And that examples that we saw yesterday, because this is a kind of summary of what we did yesterday. So going to becomes gonna, ne pas becomes just pas, right? And I think we also saw that example in Latin of ille becomes Spanish el, similar in Portuguese as well. Yeah. There is some kind of examples from the Quechua auxiliaries as well, where you have those complex forms that become suffixes that mark tense and aspect. Please, next. Okay, so here's an example of this morphological reduction from Quechua. That was that verb of to go, which is quite interesting, I find, because you have this ri, right, which was originally full verb of motion that becomes reduced to this auxiliary, as in risak, I will go. Yeah. Okay, there is also another one that is quite interesting, where you have this causative suffix chi, yeah, that is also grammaticalized, and some examples like this. So we can kind of see those things across different languages. And in Quechua, I've seen somewhere saying that because it's a very it is a language that has a lot of many different kinds of suffixes, and probably all of them originated in independent words at some point. Something that will kind of brings us back during this talk about the origin of language. Yeah, because if grammaticalization happens and is the process that happens constantly, and it's the process that is always there, then one can posit that maybe at some point a language was just consisting of independent forms. Yeah, but we can see whether you can agree with that or not. But it's one of the arguments for our grammaticalization. Anyhow, please, next. Okay, Another example, another process that we talked about yesterday, and maybe I didn't touch upon this much, was the process of decategorialization. Yes, so we mentioned this, the process in which I have some lexical item that loses the properties of the original category and becomes more grammatical. So examples such as, for instance, noun becoming less noun, verbs becoming less verb. And we have clients for this. So in this talk, we're going to have different clients for a grammaticalization of nouns, grammaticalization of verbs. But generally what happens is that those categories lose some of its features and keep losing them. Yes, they change the category at the end of the day. Yeah, so they become decategorialized. Hmm? Okay. Yes, so an example, because I like those English examples, they are easy. That's why I come back to them. But if you look at the example from that old English villain, so to want, to desire, to intend, yes, so it was a full verb, full lexical verb that becomes an auxiliary in English. It loses a lot of different categories that are available for full lexical verb. An example of this kind is, for instance, the Spanish tener que, yeah, so to have to, where we have originally the verb tener, such as avoir, for instance, such as the one of habere, right? Originally a verb. In the context of a complement que, so it becomes a fixed modal construction which has different properties, decategorialized properties of the full verb. Okay, next please. Then that process, which is called obligatorification. So once our item becomes morphologically reduced, phonologically reduced, semantically bleached, and decategorialized, it also starts to serve within a given environment in which it becomes obligatory. So at first, we were talking about this coexistence of two structures at the same time, possibly not obligatory, but in the course of grammaticalization, they become obligatory. So, for instance, you can have here examples of this English do support, right? Do you want? So in examples here in Old English, you have things like hast thou bread? Literally, or like, do you have bread? Have you bread? Yeah. Before this do auxiliary grammaticalized into English. However, this do becomes obligatory in the language as an auxiliary, and then it moves towards being obligatory in other parts of the system, such as negation. So it's not just the questions anymore, but it's also negation. It spreads out. Yeah, they become obligatory, and that's the process of obligatorification. I'm sorry. Yes. So yes, so that was one process. And then another process that we discussed, please next, is the process of paradigmatization. Yeah, so we kind of mentioned it yesterday, but generally it just wants to say that the item that has been grammaticalized or is being grammaticalized becomes part of a paradigm. Yeah, those markers, they join a set, such as, for instance, set of tense, aspect, mood, case, agreement, whatever, the paradigm we are talking about, or the paradigm that is in question, and starts function as a member of that paradigm. And what is interesting in this paradigmatization is that once an item becomes a member of a paradigm, this leads to a regularity and predictability of that item. Then it becomes regular within the language. Yeah. So yes, so we saw that example that I quite like, the one with cantare habeo, the future tense, the creation of future tense in Spanish, where we can kind of see that once this bit, the possessive, well, the verb with the possessive semantics becomes part of the infinitive, the cantar, yeah, and becomes cantare. So then this verb gets paradigmatized across the board, and all the inflected forms become part of the future tense marking. Yeah, so it becomes not only obligatory, but it becomes regular within the paradigm. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Next, please. Okay, so I give here an example of paradigmatization in case of Finnish. Finnish is a quite nice example because it's not an Indo-European language. It is an Uralic language from Ural, so related to Kartvelian languages in the western part of Siberia, if you will. So it's quite interesting because we kind of have this shows us, just this process of paradigmatization. We have a number of independent postposition that become suffixes. Finnish as a language is known to have a system of 20-something different case marking. And those case markings, so it's a huge system. If you look at the Slavic languages or Indo-European that had 8 cases, the Finnish is like triple cases. Yeah, but all those cases in Finnish, they become they come from those independent postpositions that became gradually suffixes, and they became incorporated into the case paradigm. So there is this kind of tendency of incorporating more and more postpositions and extending the case system. Yeah. So an example here is here from Proto-Finnic, the postposition pele, so on top, yeah? And then this gets reduced as in any kind of process of grammaticalization, some kind of erosion, morphological, phonological, and it becomes la, yeah? So, so you kind of have talola at the house, yes, but it all comes from the postposition. This la these days is a case marker. Yeah. Okay. And this process, it's not just happening for this specific marker, it's the process that happens across the board. So other postpositions, obviously not all of them, but many postpositions go through the same process. So for instance, the postposition taka, yeah, becomes a case marker of takana, which means behind another case in the case system. Yeah, but they all come from postpositions. Okay, please next. Okay, so we also talked yesterday about layering, and today we will talk about layering as well. Yes, so this idea of layering is where the old and new grammatical forms coexist at the same time in a given language. Because we said yesterday that the change is not happening from A to B, but the change is from A, B, and then B, where A and B coexist at the same time for periods of time. And those periods of time might last up to several hundred years, on which the competition between one or the other construction or a form is won. Yeah. Okay, so that's this case of layering, yeah? So, example, this layering, if we have two constructions being used at the same time, it means it's a clear proof that the grammaticalization process is in progress. It's happening, yeah? Because we have two constructions competing one against the other. The grammaticalization is not towards the end of its one path, yes, but it's being in chain, it's being in process, yeah. So I gave you an example of this, my favorite example of je ne sais pas, right? I don't know, in which at some stages of the language in French, you had je ne sais, right? And at some point you also had je ne sais pas. So both were possible at some point in a language to be used. Yeah, and then we will see today in the presentation is that somehow this je ne sais pas, where this pas was kind of this emphatic, more stronger negation, yeah, but both existed. So they were in the process of layering. Then at some point in the language, this construction, je ne parle pas, wins the fight, yeah, and continues to grammaticalize. Because I said to you that you can say in some varieties today, je parle pas, yeah, I don't speak. So it still continues, but the idea is that they coexist at the same time, and at some point, because of some reasons, one wins. Yeah. But it's many cases in the languages that we see is that we are still in this process. Yeah. So we would like, when we talk about grammaticalization, you don't need to show the end result, the end process. Oh, it grammaticalized, that's it. No, you can also talk about grammaticalizing item in terms of the layering in which you are still in the process of layering. Yeah, it doesn't mean you can perfectly talk about grammaticalization even if two constructions are still possible. Yeah, it's just that you didn't get there, but you are maybe like a little bit here on the climb. Please, next. Oh yes, and something that we will talk today a little bit, yeah. Something that I didn't mention, but this thing will pop up in grammaticalization. It's this idea of persistence, yeah. So when we have an item that is being grammaticalized or an item that has grammaticalized, we will see that some parts, some traces of the original lexical item, that meaning is still there. Yeah. So we never get a grammaticalization where you have this lexical item semantic bleaching and it loses completely all the meaning. Yeah. So some part of the original meaning you will be able to trace back. Generally, obviously, there are examples where it's completely semantically bleached, but but many times there is this persistence. Yeah. And that persistence might influence how the grammatical form is used. Yeah. Because it kind of guides our grammaticalization, those original meanings that don't get lost. Yeah. Because look at this example, will, again. Yeah. Today, will in English is the future tense. But if you think about it, if you look at how will is actually used, yeah, there is still some volition in some of the context of will. Originally, it, as I said before, it meant to want, to intend, to desire, yeah, but there is a volition in some context. For instance, I will do it. I intend to do it. And that original intent is still there. That's persistence. So you're basically talking about some kind of residues, original meanings of the word that just doesn't get lost. It's somewhere still there. Okay, please, next. And I think the final mechanism is that of fusion. Yes, because it's quite interesting. You can kind of look at grammaticalization from from different perspectives, right? You can have this phonological reduction, morphological reduction, but there is also fusion, yeah, where the idea of fusion is something phonological as well, but it kind of extends onto grammaticalization. So you basically have two independent items that merge into one inseparable form, yeah? So sure, there is phonological reduction, there is grammaticalization, but those forms merge, yeah? They become fused. Example of those forms are, for instance, from Spanish del, I think, like na Brazil, no? We also have all those things, right? Like that nel in Italian as well. But this is gonna be important because sometimes the counter examples of grammaticalization, right? We talked about this unidirectionality theory yesterday, like hypothesis yesterday. I said there is a line going from independent lexical forms into more grammatical clitics, suffixes, and that's the line. But Gabi yesterday has mentioned that there are counter examples of grammaticalizations. And many of those counter examples of grammaticalizations come from fused elements. They became so fused that the speakers that use those words, they don't recognize where they come from. And because they don't recognize them as grammatical elements, they start treating them as somehow lexical elements. I mean, depends on the example, but they start treat them as elements, and then they become re-grammaticalized because the speakers don't know the history of the words. Therefore, they can use them again for grammaticalization. So many of the examples of counter-grammaticalization comes from precisely those fused, unanalyzable items that becomes inseparable. Yeah, we will see this. Okay, next, please. Oh. And another mechanisms that we are gonna discuss today, and something that I will come back to, so that's why I'm mentioning it now, for you guys to kind of remember about this, is the mechanism of divergence. Yeah. So in the mechanism of divergence, the idea is that we have an item that is being grammaticalized. Yeah. But many of those items are polysemous. So let's say I have the item A. My item A starts getting new meanings. So the meaning of my item is AB. Yeah, they get more meanings. They get new meanings. And now, one of those two meanings that I have now for my item might grammaticalize, and the other might not. So we kind of get a divergence, a split of the same item being grammaticalized depending what the meaning is, but they all come from the same source. Yeah. So, for instance, look at this English verb have. I have a book. Yeah, and I have eaten. So generally, you might kind of want to see this in a way in which have is this possessive verb, yes, and then it grammaticalized into a perfective tense. So I have two instances of the same thing, but I have the possessive still exists. I have a book, you can still talk about I am the possessor of the book. So you kind of have a divergence in which the verb have has two different meanings. Yeah, one grammaticalized, the other one not. Yeah. Okay, please next. Now, in addition to divergence, there is also a term referring to extension. Yeah. Now, we can talk about extension in terms of grammatical markers that spreads into new functional and structural contexts. So it's not paradigmatization in which my element enters into a paradigm. This is the idea that I have an element which is grammaticalizing and it enters new contexts in which it can occur. Yeah. So, for instance, an example would be that ille, that I quite like in Latin, that is the origin of the definite articles in the Romance languages. So you have this kind of, so you had that demonstrative, the use of the demonstrative extended, yeah? It extended to function in the context of definiteness. Yeah, that's the extension, not just paradigmatization, on top of decategorialization, sure, but also extension of the context in which it functions. Please, next. And the last example, well, the last mechanism that I mentioned yesterday, but you might not, that was very briefly mentioned, is the idea of renewal. Yeah, renewal in grammaticalization is where I have a new lexical material that is entering my grammar to replace something that I already have. Yeah. So there may be many reasons why that happens. There is this kind of speaker here oriented functional theory explaining why that might happen. We can talk about this a little bit later, why it happens, but generally we have one form that gets worn down. So basically just speakers want to change something because it just becomes too boring, if you will. Yeah, it's like, it's very simple words, but generally you kind of have speakers creating out of necessity something new, just to be creative about the language, and they recruit new expression to fulfill a function that already exists in the language. Yeah. So that's this idea of this mechanism of renewal. Yeah. So it comes from this kind of idea that we have items that grammaticalize, they become morphologically, semantically bleached, they become weaker, unstressed, they are not that visible in the language. And once that happens, the speakers look for more expressive construction, yeah, to express the same thing. So they kind of try to incorporate new ways of saying the same thing. And that's what's called renewal in grammaticalization. We will come back to this, but just keep in mind, yeah, for the time being, that there is such a thing as renewal. Please, next. Okay. So we are going now to this section on pragmatic factors in grammaticalization. Why is it that grammaticalization happens? What are the reasons for it from the point of view of pragmatics? Let me see how much time we actually have. At what time is the coffee? 10:30. Okay, perfect. Perfect. So half an hour. Mm. Okay, please next. Okay, so yesterday I kind of asked the question of why grammaticalization happen, how reanalysis and analogy happen, what enables those mechanisms to happen generally. Yeah. So what are the motivations and the factors that enable grammaticalization, but from the pragmatic point of view? Yeah, from the point of view of a speaker trying to, well, being part of the society, being part of the community, what happens, what motivates those grammaticalization, grammaticalization to happen? Okay, so this is the question of this chapter. So please next. Okay, so a lot of people have tried to understand why change in language happen, why grammaticalization happen in terms of motivations. And there has been three different theories or maybe frameworks how people explain that change. One of the motivation is the role of child language acquisition. We talked a little bit about this yesterday in terms of generative theory of the universals, parameters and paradigms, all those things. I'm not going to focus on this because I assume that many of us know about generative grammar. But one of the one of other types of explanation or maybe factors that enable motivation for grammaticalization is the role of the community and the contact between other groups. Yeah, that also might be a factor for grammaticalization to happen. Yeah, and the third idea for motivations is this kind of interaction or negotiation between the speaker and the hearer during a communicative exchange, yes, to negotiate the meaning. Yes, so I say one thing, then you basically answer and try to understand, interpret what I'm saying. You say your thing. So that's more or less something like communicative discourse analysis. Yes, why things happen, and we kind of see those things. Some examples of grammaticalization coming from discourse, generally from discourse, of some kind of connectives. Something that is that to these days are connectives in English. Some of them come from this discourse where you have a speaker here talking, and using one certain type of a particle that with time becomes a discourse marker. Yeah, and they are proved to be the origin proved to be from the negotiations of the meaning between speaker and the hearer. Yeah, and that can be extended to motivate grammaticalization on a broader scale. Yeah, but generally, when you talk about grammaticalization, it's not just one thing only, but it's a number of factors that happen. Yeah, so it's basically a combination of factors. And I'm not sure if you guys have heard about Grice's maxims. So for communication, the maxim of quantity, relevance, and so forth. So generally, those maxims, they talk about when you try to communicate, you try to be as brief as possible, as clear as possible, as communicative as possible, as relevant as possible when you try to bring your message across. Yeah. So generally, the idea for communication in terms of negotiation of meaning is the maximization of economy, of simplicity of the message that you bring across. Yeah, I'm trying to be, I don't try to, like when I talk, then I try just to bring my message across. I'm trying to be as economic, as simple as possible for the speaker to understand what I'm trying to say. Yeah. So when the change happens, speakers generally try to be different. Yeah. They try to say the same thing in different ways, but that different way can't be too different. And they try to be maximally informative at the same time. So you try to use little, but you try to be maximally informative in what you're saying. We can come back to this, but it's one of the motivation, right? Why those factors in the speaker mind work for grammaticalization to happen. Yeah. Yes. The change generally, yeah, for grammaticalization might be because there is different conflict in understanding between the speaker and the hearer. So that happens in terms of, for instance, ages. Sometimes a grandfather talks to a child, right? Even within the same language, but what the grandfather might mean might not be the same as what the child means just because of the age difference. Yeah. So in addition to the language, there is other factors such as age, culture, social background, education, everything that might account for the different understanding between speakers. Yeah. And that's where that change might also occur in addition to all of this. Yeah.
I don't choose the micro.
But I think, but the people wanted, like, they can't hear. So if you want to, I can also rephrase your question.
Okay. No, it's just, are you saying that we need to factor better grammaticalization occurs?
I see.
And so are you saying the cognitive factor in which inflicts in grammaticalization process are the linguistics economy?
And the social linguistics.
Yes. So generally, this is what I'm trying to say, that it's a combination of all those different factors. Yeah. So cognitive, social, how that's why to kind of predict grammaticalization is so difficult, because you might show tendencies across the world in terms of, for instance, our lexical item of movement is grammaticalizing into a future tense. Sure, that's what we see in many languages, but it doesn't have to. Grammaticalization can be predicted, but it's not 100% certain that it will happen because of the cognition of the person, because of the culture, the age, the social background, because of, just this kind of idea of economy of speech, because of negotiation of meaning, the communities, the contact. That's why grammaticalization is not a hard science in terms of predicting that if I have the noun for my back, that will grammaticalize into at position, talking about, behind or something like this. It might, because this is what we see across languages, but it doesn't have to, because we don't know what's going to happen in a language, in a given community. So this is a kind of motivation for grammaticalization, but it's only a motivation. Thank you. Please, next. I lost my water. Wait. Okay. Now, there is, like, when you look at the production of speech, you also see that generally, even if you're not talking about grammaticalization, among the speakers, there's a tendency to reduce the speech signal. So when we talk, and we talk quickly, it will get reduced, yes? So this is a natural tendency for human being to reduce the simplicity of the signal. So simplicity of what I'm saying, yeah? And that simplicity is the result of something that we are gonna see in this presentation called routinization. Yeah, routinization for grammaticalization will be very important because certain things, the way we say them in terms of chunks. Yeah, I don't know. For instance, you can say if you want to say no in English, you might say no way, and that no occurs with way. No way. This is just a colloquial expression of saying no, just like kind of slangish, if you will. However, it becomes routinized. It becomes an idiom in a sense. So you're talking about idiomatization of a construction. Once it is idiomatized, routinized, in the rapid speech, we tend to reduce the speech signal. Yeah, we make it more simple. So going to be becomes gonna. Yeah, because of the frequency, and we'll talk about frequency in this presentation later on in chapter number 5. Okay, please next. I actually gave example of routinization here, but we'll come back to this. So something that I said before, grammaticalization emerges from frequent repetition of expressions. Yeah. And that might lead to predictability, reduction, and reanalysis because of how those expressions occur. Yeah. But we will also see that although this is the case for many of the grammaticalization cases across the languages, in some cases, our routinization, yeah, that helps to grammaticalize a lot of elements, might actually be responsible for retaining the older forms. So when certain items are frequent, for instance, the verb to be, yeah, it doesn't follow the paradigm of the normal verbs in English because of the frequency of usage. So the frequency might also retain the grammaticalization, yeah, because the verb in English to be, yeah, I mean, it should be like I go, you go, he goes, and so forth. Just the same form. But with the verb to be and other frequently used verbs, yes, we see that they don't get into the paradigm similarly grammaticalized as other elements. So therefore, you have I am, but you are, but she, he is. Yeah. So we talk about routinization that helps a lot of grammaticalization, frequent expressions, frequent repetitions of the same. They are predictable. They become reduced. Yeah. But in some cases, it will not help. It will actually stop grammaticalization. Yeah. Okay. Please next. Okay, so we talked about motivations before, and routinization is balanced in normal language. That, in a sense, that when you have language within the community, you cannot routinize everything. Because then the speech would just become a string of routinized expressions, and there would be no creativity, there would be no innovations. So generally, this is kind of balanced. So we have routinized expressions, but we have also new expressions coming in. So the language is always trying to level it up. Yeah, it can't be too many new expressions. Yeah, but it can't be too many routinized expressions either. Yeah, so you're basically you're talking about this balanced normal language situations. Yeah, so as we have routinization of expressions, then we also might have de-routinization of new expressions. Because we talked about expansion before. We talk about, just why grammaticalization happen. Now, if in a given context, let's say for our future tense, just pick any context in the grammar, if things become too routinized, to level up, speakers will look for new ways because of different reasons. I'm not saying that just they wake up one day and they think, hey, our future tense is boring. No, this is not what I'm saying. But speakers will try to enhance expressivity and de-routinize something that is already routinized. So that's why I'm talking about this interplay of routinization and innovation or de-routinization. Yeah, always a balance. Please, next. Yeah, so I give you kind of, did I give you, yes, so for instance, we talked about de-routinization, basically the counterpart of routinization, but I will give you an example here from English. So we currently in synchronically in English of what English is today, how we know it, it has this routinized future tense of will and be going to. Yeah, I will come, I'm going to come. Yeah, that's our routinized expressions. And then we have new expressions coming into the language to de-routinized expressions that already exist, that are the routine, if you will. So you have, so in some variations of English, this becomes not just lexical expression, but more and more grammaticalizing to express future tenses. So you can say, I am about to have coffee. Yeah, and it starts to be used as a new way for future tense marking. She's about to leave. I've seen some varieties of English using also for the future tense be fixing to. So you can say, I'm fixing to go. So I'm about to go, I'm about to leave, I will leave. I intend to leave, yeah? So you're talking about the routinization. We have routinized expressions expressing future tense for whatever reason, for whatever motivation for the speakers, yes? You start getting new expressions to de-routinize something that already exists. So kind of, it refreshes the language. It makes it new, it makes it change. Please, next. Okay, Hopper and Traugott, they argue that any change in grammaticalization, any change in language is goal-oriented. Yeah, what do they mean by the definition of goal-oriented? They mean that, as we talked yesterday, and maybe it was not too clear for you why we talked about deduction, induction, abduction, all of those things, is that when we talk, we use all those mechanisms in order to understand what the other person is saying. Yeah? And this is what this goal-oriented is. My speaker has some kind of a goal that I'm trying to understand, and I'm using all the sorts of reasoning mechanisms so I can understand what that person is saying. Yeah, we said that it was deduction, induction, abduction, whatever, you know, that mechanism is, it's goal-oriented. I'm trying to resolve a problem of understanding what the other person is talking about. And many times, you know, just this problem-solving mechanism might not be conscious. Sometimes it might be. Like, for instance, when you guys are talking to me in Portuguese, I mean, I'm very conscious that I'm trying to solve the problem. Okay, what is the person talking about? Yeah, but generally, when you talk to people that goal-oriented, is might not be that conscious, yeah, of a mechanism. And that change, yeah, that change in the language, why grammaticalization happened, is that it might be caused by the intentions that the speaker and the hearer might have. Yeah, so we talked about this understanding, problem solving, where a person might mean something, but the other person meant something else, but this is the output. Do you guys remember what we talked about? This grammar 1, output 1, grammar 2, output 2, yeah? So those are intentions of the speaker. So our grammar 1, the speaker of grammar 1, with the output 1, and then I am trying to solve the problem, what the grammar is, what the output is. I'm listening to you, and then I arrive at my grammar 2 and the output 2, yeah? And that's where the problem might start for the grammaticalization generally to come in, yeah? Because I didn't understand the way you understood it. And we are talking, you know, just about the community of speakers. Many times, you know, on the level of child acquisition, yeah, the output of the child might have been different from what it is intended, yeah. So that's why we're talking about the intentions. They might be misunderstood. I might take a construction, rebracket it in my brain, so start doing reanalysis, and then with my reanalysis, starting doing analogy, but on the wrong assumption, because I didn't understand it right. Yeah, this is very simply saying, but this is generally how it works. Please, next. Oh, and this is gonna be cool, because I wanted to, guys, I wanted to ask you about this. Yeah, maybe not in this slide, but in the next slide. So we talk about grammaticalization, blah, 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 beautiful, nice, all the clients, yeah? But we also have to talk in terms of grammaticalization, we need to talk about language engineering, yeah? And I think these days, language engineering is something that happens a lot. For instance, in the politics of the United States, in which you have he, she, her, or them, for instance. So, okay, you, like, I'm not sure if you've seen, but in English, for instance, and that's why I wanted to ask you about the Portuguese, I've seen this happening in Spanish. For instance, when you have, in Portuguese as well, I've seen it, I think, in one of the presentations at Amazonica, somebody said, obrigado, instead of obrigada, obrigado, and I wasn't quite sure if that's obrigado is something, you know, just from this gender politics of usage of different pronouns, yeah? So, okay, so from this perspective, we talked about language engineering and grammaticalization, because language engineering is something deliberate, yeah? We make this on purpose. We are conscious of the process that we are doing, yeah? And we can either change the language, or we can regulate the change that happens in the language. Generally, we talked about standardization yesterday, yeah? That standardization might impede grammaticalization, because generally different varieties of the language allow different structures, different ways of expressions. But once you kind of start having the standardized language, then many of those different ways of saying the same constructions stop. Yeah, I mean, there's only one way, the descriptive way, the prescriptive way, not the descriptive way. Yeah, we prescribe the language. So it kind of happens on the same level. Yeah, and the mechanism of grammaticalization, yes, is generally what we see usage driven. Yeah, so we want to say that it's descriptive. Yeah, grammaticalization comes from the way the language is used, not prescribed, but used. Yeah, and language engineering is prescribed. Yeah, it's intentional. The change doesn't come from the way that people talk. The change comes from special intention that somebody might have about the language that is spoken. Yeah? Okay. Now, so keep this in mind. And those things, as I said, standardization, language engineering, they can either accelerate or block grammaticalization. Yeah? And most of the times they will block grammaticalization, but sometimes they might accelerate for certain construction to become much more used. Yeah? Yes. What language engineering might also do is that when it accelerates standardization and they introduce new ways, new constructions, those new constructions that are introduced, they with some time, they might undergo natural grammaticalization themselves because it's the natural process of language usage. Yeah, but it started as this kind of intentional process. Yeah. Now, also, what's interesting about engineering of the language and grammaticalization is that that engineering will influence the variance of constructions that will survive. So, for instance, when you talk about linguistic diversity, you can talk about diversity of different constructions according to a different variation of languages, you know, or dialects. Let's say we have a language family such as the Witotoan languages. Now, within the Witotoan languages spoken in Colombia, we have 4 different dialects. Each dialect has about 70 clanolects. Imagine how many constructions there are that distinguish those clanolects. It's not the same, right? Now, if we start playing with the standardization and language engineering of those different variants, we will choose certain variants that will become the norm. Yeah. So that those variants, so the majority of the variants from the languages that we will not choose will simply pass away, will disappear. Yeah. There will be some layering at first, some persistence, but at the end of the day, only a few will survive. So please, next section. Okay, I give you some examples about language engineering based on Quechua. Yes, so generally, we have some, like I've seen in Quechua, that generally you have a future tense in Quechua, which is expressed through different affixes. So, for instance, you know, the ri that we saw that grammaticalized into the future tense marker, meaning to go. Now, when we have standardization and language engineering and making all those different varieties of Quechua speaking one variant, yeah, the standardized version, we see that certain things happen. So, for instance, for education, you have the future generally is taught through analytic constructions. Yeah, so it's not the suffix, you know, just that is being taught, although some varieties have that ri, but it's generally the analytic constructions which reinforces analytic constructions to take part, to be part of the language and therefore grammaticalize further on later on, and leaving our ri, pues as I started speaking Spanish because I'm thinking that you are, and leaving our re to be, yeah? So it might grammaticalize further, but generally what will remain is this analytic construction that is being taught. That's why we're talking about language engineering. Please go next. And yes, and before we kind of start before we start talking about Brazil, I wanted to show you an example in Canada. That was, I believe, 2019, where you have where you kind of had this idea that the Senate or Parliament wanted to introduce this gender neutral pronouns in the official usage in the parliament, and some of the senators was afraid that it would take the liberty, it will take his liberty away because he cannot express him, her anymore, but he needs to talk about them, yeah, or any other form, yeah. Please, next. Yeah, so here, in that controversy in Canada, you're talking about free speech, yes? You're talking about being forced to use gender-neutral pronoun, and in his way of seeing things, you're talking about protection against discrimination of the ones that use the free speech, yeah? So it's like completely the other way around, in which you don't allow other people to use free pronouns, but he is talking about by engineering the new way of talking, this is discrimination, yeah? So that was that was this kind of idea. And the next slide. Yes, so I'm not sure what time it is. Yeah. Okay. So so we can kind of maybe talk about language engineering in terms of Brazil. Yeah. Because like when it comes to the pronouns in Brazilian, well, in Portuguese, I kind of looked at it yesterday, and like I wanted to find out about the etymology of pronouns, how they grammaticalized. I've seen that you have this ille, right? The Latin ille, which meant that. In Old Portuguese, el, and modern Portuguese, ella, ella, right? And I think there was also some influenced usage of ipse, which meant self, very that influenced, just the creation of the pronouns in Brazilian, in Portuguese. And this definite article, I also seen that you have this OA, right, UA, that emerged as a grammaticalization of the demonstrative as well. So I was kind of like going into this discussion about language engineering and the pronouns of this day. I wanted to kind of see where it all comes from. Yeah. Yeah. Maybe we can go a little bit like to the next slide. Yeah, I also looked at the rise of VOS, yeah, and VOSesh, where you kind of have that form VOS for you for plural, all Portuguese VOS, and then grammaticalization of vossa mercê, vossa mercê, and then voce and ivosech. Yeah, so this kind of VOS was this archaic, and voce was replaced for the second person. And that was the natural, normal grammaticalization that happened in the language based on the use of the language by the community of the speakers. Now, what happens when we start having language engineering for the pronouns in Brazilian language these days? And this is what I wanted to talk to you guys today about. If you could tell me what's the perspective on, gender neutral pronouns in Brazil, how does that work, and what you think in terms of language engineered way of language change versus the natural, normal, usage-based grammaticalization. We have a few minutes before the coffee. Once you say something, then maybe we can go for coffee. How is it in Brazil these days? I know the situation in Spanish in Colombia, but how is here?
I have to go out to take care of something, so let me say something before I leave. Well, there is an issue here, but it's an issue that is isolated, just like in the U.S. It's isolated to the university context, and it's not an issue outside the university context in general. Perhaps some movements, and it's more with the quantifier. Everyone, todos. That's a big thing now, much more than the article. So it started with the quantifier. People start using todes as the neutral form, todas, todos, and todes. And some people are trying to generalize to other words, but very unsuccessfully and very restricted to the domain of the university. But among the people that are involved with activist movement, it's a big thing.
Thank you very much. So maybe we can actually go for coffee. We can think about it and just have a small discussion after we come back, because I'm very interested, like what CG was saying, to other contexts as well. Like CG is saying, unsuccessful, but maybe we can talk about it after the coffee so we can kind of get some more energy before we start discussing. Thank you. Okay, see you guys in half an hour. At 11, right? 11, yes. Okay, you guys, maybe just 1 minute more because like a lot of mosquitoes bit me in my legs and I need to get scratched. Just give me a minute. Okay, so we kind of stopped at discussing this language engineering in the Brazilian Portuguese. So I kind of wonder if you had a moment to think about this and like maybe talk about it. You can also talk in Portuguese if you'd like, but I would like to talk a little bit more about language engineering, development of different pronouns or different like what CG said, todish was it instead of todis, and what your thoughts about grammaticalization in this area.
And
Would be interesting to hear the women and the other people, perhaps the Gilson. Ela quer saber sobre a questão da linguagem neutra. Eu estou dizendo que seria bom ouvir as mulheres e os outros, além dos homens. Os héteros e os não héteros, ok? A questão do todes e...
I don't like to speak on the microphone. When I started to talk on the microphone, I get some mistakes in my speech because I'm getting nervous. About this language engineering and the neutral pronoun phenomenon there is in a change in Portuguese language, I think this is a more political change in the language because some people in LGBTQR plus community didn't feel included in our language pronouns as well. But I think this is a process. It's not accepted for the mostly in the mostly speakers here in Brazil, but I think it's a younger movement for young from the it started in the university, this kind of discussions, because there are, for example, here in UFPA, a lot of LGBTQR plus people, and they started to talk about it, this feeling of not feeling included by her, he, she, his, and I think this is not the solution for my personal opinion. This is not the solution because the neutral pronoun in Portuguese, we have a lot of historical explanation for why the pronouns are like this they are. And I think this kind of discussion is still so fresh to be uh, using in the language for all the all the generations, because the older people are more resistant to use this. And I think this is a more open mind people who use it. Like here in the university, I don't see so much professors using this as Sydney use, even in his emails or in his messages in WhatsApp or other communication vehicles. And for me, I try to respect. When someone asks me, can you call me like this? I will respect this. But in my writing, I don't use to, I not use it to use this. But if I'm asked for, I will use. But it's a more political discuss, and I cannot elaborate so much in English because I think in Portuguese. But if I can add something before someone talk, I will discuss.
And what do you think? Because I mean, like those forms like tojis that didn't exist in the previous generation, now it does. And in the next generation, it might become, its frequency of usage might become even greater. How do you think, like, what's your idea? What might happen in terms of grammaticalization of those terms, where you have new generation, where this is used on a normal basis? For us, it's something new, you know, we might feel more comfortable, less comfortable with it, regardless. But what do you think in terms of grammaticalization? You know, how it might go into the future? Um,
I think uh, this process is still going on. So the grammaticalization process is a consequence of this changing in language. And I think perhaps in the future people will create some different neutral pronouns in Portuguese, because for me this told is not will not fix the problem of inclusion in the LGBTQR plus community. But I think this change in grammaticalization is not stabilized as well. And this is pretty new for assume something and think about the stages of the process, because this started in so many different ways. Some people, there is a variation in these neutral pronouns, because some people use todes, but there are other people who use to, an X, and an S after the X. And some other people use como é? Arroba. Eu esqueci em inglês. Ads. Use ads, and other people use. There is a lot of. I saw in the internet some other variations, but I do not remember right now. And I think this is not a. There is a large field research there. Someone who will be working in the grammaticalization process can start to think. If someone here in this course feel interested, it will be a interesting study.
Thank you so much, Gabriela, because it's quite interesting in terms of grammaticalization, how the language is being changed and what might happen in the future. I kind of wonder if this types of development is only seen in major languages, or whether anybody of you has seen this happening for indigenous languages as well.
Well, I don't know about other languages. I mean, indigenous languages so far, not this kind of thing. I haven't seen, but I mean, about the specific, I have some. I have some idea of what's going to happen in terms of grammaticalization based on the experience in the US. I think there is no chance. I think it's the wrong place to invest energy. People shouldn't mess with grammar. because it's much, much more difficult in Portuguese than in English. In English, they failed, right? It was restricted to the university environment, the use of he or she or that kind of thing. So it failed. And it's just the pronoun. In Portuguese, it's agreement. It's horrible because you have the noun and you have the agreement with the adjective, and you have the agreement with the possessive pronoun, and you have the agreement with the quantifier. It's too many things to change. So I think the best chance is when someone that is like very popular starts using, or some people very popular start using, then maybe it will increase the use of todes. But there's no chance it's going to change the agreement, because that's the thing. If you change from todas or todos to todes, there is consequence in the agreement, and it's too much to change. So I think there could be a new sort of agreement in which the todes is gonna be used, but the agreement will become either masculine or feminine, because it's too complex to change. That's why I think it's the wrong place to spend energy. You got a better chance if you invest in the lexical vocabulary. I think it's easier.
What about one moment, Gabriela? What about the perspective of the males? In addition to the professor, but like, what are your thoughts about what's happening in terms of the developments and what might happen one day to
Neutral gender in Portuguese?
yes, like how, like what we see here, for instance, one day there was that boss, and then so in this
I agree a little bit with City because about the neutral gender in Portuguese, I think it's a more social than linguistic perspective, because social dynamics is so fast, uh, and grammaticalization need more time to establish in the language, so people can create and integrate into grammar of the Portuguese the morpheme that not exist. So it's a problem with agreement in Portuguese, because we can say todos, but how can I agree this todos with a verb, for example? It's a problem. And I I respect, I don't use too much, but I respect and I understand this change. It's a necessary, I think, change, but people can, this change is fast, and I think it's a problem, because how can I say that grammaticalization is a step-by-step process, and it's impossible, I think. You can say about that better me, because uh, I don't know. And yes, it's the change into the morphology of the language. It's not a lexicon. Do you create a word and it's fast to the all community can use the word? Yes.
Those are very good insights, but I wanted to show you one thing, and we are going to see it later in the presentation. In that German, I forgot the variation of the German that is spoken in the US by the Mennonites. There is a grammaticalization of the verb to want, yes, because of a social change, because they are very religious people. And in their religion, you can't want something, you can't desire something. You have to go through another process. You have to make, just this. So generally, there is grammaticalization that is also forced by the social process against the culture that you have, that makes grammaticalization possible. So I think that maybe if this continues with Tojis, I think there might be something in the future that we are facing. It's just that our generation is too close to see this. And I think we also get into this problem of different fusional languages. Because for some languages, such as agglutinative languages, where you just have one morpheme is one syllable, Asian languages, for instance, you can play much more around because the agreement is not as strong. But for the languages such as the Romance languages, where the agreement needs to be done, it's a very much more complicated process. So one would think that maybe in some languages, this will be much more common than in languages such as Portuguese, where this is very difficult to do. In the Slavic languages as well, people don't know how to do it. We don't even have the Tojis. We just have an idea that there should be Tojis, but we don't even know how to create it morphologically because there is no way of doing this. The agreement in the Slavic languages is much more difficult because it's not just the agreement for one case, but it's agreement for 7 different cases. So imagine Tojis, but conjugate like declined for 7 different cases. So I think there are languages that will allow it much easier and languages that will not. But I wanted to give the voice to Matthias as well, because I want to give the voice to everybody.
No, I think you started to talk a little bit what I want to, because I think the social environment is the main environment to almost all the language change we have, and when you're talking about this, I was thinking if we can talk about the neutral gender in terms of reanalysis of the inflectional paradigm, gender inflectional paradigm. So and I think it's a reality in the language. I always say that we discuss, as linguists, we discuss a lot about this, specifically the implications for the language, for Portuguese language, but I think it's an ongoing process. People are doing this, so people are reanalyzing this form, this paradigm, and I think it's really, really, really possible that in the near future we see this form and the process of agreement in the inflectional paradigm of gender in Portuguese, really, because it's almost almost changes is doing like that. So
thank you very much, Matthias. I wanted to draw your attention to something that we discussed before, the content and the function words. Because it seems that there is a distinction in terms how easily things grammaticalize once they are content words and they belong to this open system, and once that they belong to this very closed class. So for instance, pronouns, generally, this is a closed class of words. It has, I don't know how many pronouns in Portuguese, let's say 10. I invent things, I don't know. But let's say 10, and it's 10 and no more. Yeah, so like to kind of get grammaticalization going into such a small closed class, a class of words, it's very difficult. However, we see that it's possible. in contact situation. And when you talk about contact, then you also talk about social implications, right? I mean, we will see in one of the presentations in 2 days, we're going to talk about area linguistics and contact, and how the contact can influence grammaticalization. Yeah. So in a small language, such as, for instance, the Arawak-Resigaro language, that where the people were slashed off, and only a few survival, just of the group went to live with the Bora people, different language family. They started to develop inclusive, exclusive pronoun distinctions. So that thing under contact was borrowed, but later on grammaticalized. So those things are possible. But I think it's very much social. It's very much, there is that punctuation and equilibrium theory that talks about that the language exists in equilibrium. Nothing happens. This change is slow, and it goes in the natural way. Now, at some point, there is a war, there is a contact, there is something happens, and then huge things happen in the language. Grammaticalization might be moved very much quicker than what it was in the time of equilibrium, where things were moving in naturally. So I think that when it comes to grammaticalization of those things, we have to take all of those things into account. I'm sure that Frida also wanted to say something. No? Somebody else, maybe? You girls? No? Yes? I see.
It's good. My friend Elijah.
No, no, I agree with you.
Well, if something like comes across to your mind, please let me know, and we can discuss this. But it's a very interesting issue in terms of grammaticalization, because it brings a lot of fields, across. It's a multifactorial process, and not just in this ideal world where grammaticalization goes the way it goes, hundreds of years in a natural process, then we see those things like what we saw is be going to in English. But in many of the cases that we will see, there is something that happens in the community, something that happens in the language that allow for the change to happen as well. Yeah, doesn't need to be hundreds of years. And I think that's the answer to one of your questions yesterday, whether how long those things need to be, for it to grammaticalized. Okay, so maybe we can go further. It doesn't scratch me anymore, the mosquito, so I'm fine. Please, the next slide. One before, maybe. Yes, the next one, please. Well, maybe the next one. We kind of discussed this already. Okay, so now we talked about different motivations in terms of how the grammaticalization might happen, but there is the motivations that can be divided into different ones. In terms of meaning change, we can distinguish cognitive motivation, semantic, pragmatic, a metaphorical process, and metonymic process. Those are important to kind of see what type of change we might expect when there is a grammaticalization process happening, right? And as I said, many of them will coexist. So it's not just one type of a process for one construction, but many of them will coexist because a construction is a living being. It's so maybe we'd start with the cognitive motivations, please. Next. Okay. So the idea of change when it comes to the cognitive processes that are involved in motivation is this idea that grammaticalization is driven by how speakers conceptualize experience. Yeah, and we all have our own way of conceptualizing the world and how we experience it. So the cognitive processes, they might be responsible for reinterpretation of certain forms. Yes, this is on the cognitive level. Yeah. Generally, what happens is that we tend to make from concrete meanings abstract meanings as well. Yeah. So we will see that in terms of metaphors, and so we use concrete things to denote abstract things. One of this very famous metaphorical expression, but it's still the cognition, is that expression of the time is money. Yeah. Time is this abstract thing, but it actually just denotes the money, because money is like this concrete being that is extended onto the abstract domains. Yeah. So yes, so this is what we've seen as well in grammaticalization. In grammaticalization, we have a much more specific things that become generalized. You can compare it in terms of the cognitive motivations of concrete becoming more abstract, less semantically dense, if you will. Yeah, that's why it is often linked to metaphorical extension. You can see, for an example of this is towards in Spanish, the adposition a. Me voy a Belén in Spanish. That a comes from the Latin at, which means towards, hacia, towards Belén. And that a, which kind of has this concrete meaning of direction to, grammaticalizes into abstract meanings of va a cantar. Yeah? So there is this cognitive implication of concrete, more abstract, that we also see in grammaticalization. Okay. I think one of this concrete abstract meaning extension is something that I really quite like, this grammaticalization of body part terms, because you see them in many languages. Well, in the majority of languages that I know, there is some kind of body part terms grammaticalization into grammatical markers. So this can be kind of, I don't want to say universal, but very, very often the case for many of the languages. So for instance, you kind of have this body part terms of head becoming in Quechua a relational marker, meaning on top of. Yeah, so on top of the head. So again, you kind of have this cognitive motivations of concrete becoming more abstract. Yeah, lexical more becoming grammatical. So that's why they talk about universal conceptual pathways. Yes, there is this kind of this cognitive pathways for like in human beings that allow for this type of change, that guide our grammaticalizations in certain ways, and that pathway mostly involve space to time, and we've seen many grammaticalizations of this sort. Yes, space into time. We will see some more of them, like something that is related to here and now, that extends into, temporal. Then you have possession into modality. Many times possession is used for some kind of modality meanings, and body into abstract relations. such as, for instance, the head becoming on top of, or that example that I mentioned yesterday that I just love from Witoto, from the Witotoan linguistic family, where you have the back becoming on top. Yeah. Okay. Please next. So those were the cognitive motivations.
Probably Gabi already told you. It was Lewis Stassen, the guy that I was talking about, and his work on possession. I think it relates to that one, conceptual pathways, where he shows that you get possession for existential. And he has the schemas. Also, it's Hein also, right? Who also has those schemas. And I think it relates to those conceptual pathways as the relationship between existential, possession, and location.
Yes, so you can kind of see that many times the possession is expressed by the existential clauses. Like in many languages from the southern of Colombia, you can say, my grandfather exists, meaning I have my grandfather, I have it. There is no way of having something. There is no way of possessing something, but it's the existence, the mere existence of that. And or like you're saying, for instance, many times the possession is grammaticalized by the locative clauses as well. You can say, my child is, so exists, my child exists in me, or at me. So those are very common pathways to that are motivated on the cognitive level. Why that happens? Yeah. But thank you very much. We can look at the possession. Actually, I wanted to kind of look at the possession next time that we talk. But yes, please, next. Okay, now semantic motivations. We kind of talked about these meaning shifts, yes, that reduce specificity, yeah, and they increase abstraction. You can kind of see that it's similar, just those processes, the cognitive motivation, the semantic motivation, in a sense, is similar, yeah? But it's not cognitive, it's semantic. So we kind of see that when it comes to semantic bleaching, you're talking about a loss of concrete lexical meaning, yes? There is a process of generalization. Yeah, so we will see in this presentation that many times when it comes to the lexical, when it comes to the semantic bleaching, people talk about losing meaning. But we will see in this presentation that it's not so much losing, but first it gains. A lexical item needs to gain another meaning. So at the first stage, before it loses, it gains another meaning, and that meaning gets generalized. So some linguists might actually argue whether, when it comes to the semantic bleaching, whether you're actually talking about the loss, or whether you're talking about first gaining something and then being generalized. We will come back to this later on. Yeah, but generalizing, it's quite important, because from specific sense, it becomes a broader usage. And what's also important when it comes to the semantic motivations is this kind of idea of polysemy. There will be a stage when an item grammaticalizes, and when it comes to its meaning, it will have many different, like another meaning or many different meanings before it actually, and those meanings will coexist, yeah, before either of those meanings gets lost or becomes something else. Yeah, so generally, before the items become semantically bleached, so it loses one of the meanings, there will be a stage of polysemy. Yeah. So for instance, just for that verb to be going, first as a directional verb, then it gets the like to be going. I'm going to marry Bill. First, it's this kind of directional, you know, at the first stages of grammaticalization, but there is an extra meaning of intention. Yeah, so there will be a polysemy stage where the old, so in this case the directional, will coexist with new meaning, the intention. Yeah. Okay. Okay. If I want to talk to you about this young, okay. Maybe not. Please next. Oh.
Okay. In the example of Japanese, from progressive verb be located, grammaticalized into aspect marker eng equivalent. Okay. My question is, there's some relationship with grammaticalization, for example, into semantic and morphosynthesis. For example, the verb is grammaticalized into an inflectional morpheme. And my question is some implication or order of the bleaching? For example, it's the first bleaching is semantic and after morphosynthesis, or there's no relation in this sense?
Okay. So we talked about reanalysis yesterday, and then analogy. Yeah. And now a very valid question is, where does the semantic bleaching happen? Does it happen at the beginning? Does it happen at the end? Yeah. So generally, what happens is that first something needs to happen to the meaning. So first there needs to be a change in the meaning or a new meaning attached to this for the grammaticalization to start. I don't think that you can kind of say, because semantic bleaching would be part of reanalysis. Yeah, so it's like at the beginning. With what comes first? I would say semantic bleaching, and then you would kind of go into onto syntax. But there is a lot of clients in the grammaticalization where some of the stages are simply missed. So generally in grammaticalization, certain stages will happen, but not all need to happen. So for instance, you might have semantic bleaching here, but not necessarily grammatical, restructuring. Like here we do have, because we have, progressive verb to be located becomes an aspect marker, so it needs to be structured, but it's not necessarily the case that it will happen throughout. But semantic bleaching in terms of polysemy, and then one meaning goes further to grammaticalize, is always the case. Because you can't have, for instance, like if you look at the languages, for instance, many times those general verbs grammaticalize. The verb like to go, to come, general verbs. Not the verb like, I don't know, like walking on the tiptoes. This is too specific to general, to become generalized and then go into grammaticalization. Yeah. So you you need to have that phase of semantic bleaching, but not really semantic bleaching, because as I said, we don't have a loss of something. We just have a gain of a new element, a new semantic meaning that later on becomes generalized. So for instance, if I have, just like walking on tiptoes, for whatever reason, if that grammaticalizes, then it needs to be first meaning of, I don't know, like walking on the something, some new meaning. It has to be some new meaning, and then it becomes generalized and then it's called semantically bleached because it doesn't mean walking on the tiptoes anymore. It means something else. Yeah? Okay, cool. Next, please. Okay, so we talked about cognitive motivations, semantic motivations, and now we are going to talk about pragmatic motivations. Yeah? So pragmatic motivations is driven by the context and interaction. Yeah. So generally pragmatics, I mean, always context, always interaction. So if I ask you, can you pass me the salt? I'm not asking about the ability if you can or cannot pass me the salt, or able or not able, but I'm asking for some kind of, I'm making some kind of a request of you passing me something. Yeah. So the same thing here in terms of pragmatic motivations. Yeah. So this is often linked to politeness, implicature, discourse markers, and those pragmatic motivations are specifically linked to discourse markers. We can kind of see that nouns, those related to time, to place, they often grammaticalize into discourse connectors. And that's, for instance, the example from English, a while, you know, a moment, a while, some time, a while, grammaticalized into discourse connector of while that might be true. Yeah. So we see those pragmatic motivations coming from the context and interactions, and they are especially visible in terms of the discourse markers. Another example is the Spanish pues. So from Latin post, after, right? It grammaticalizes in the discourse as well, pues. Bueno, yeah, okay. Please, next. Okay, and now two things that are especially important for the processes of grammaticalization and change is this metaphorical and metonymic processes. Starting with the metaphorical processes. Not sure if you guys have heard about conceptual metaphors. There is a huge amount of literature about, you know, conceptual metaphors. So they because we kind of have ways in our brain mapped or to like from certain way we see the world onto how we resemble the world, right? So we have this kind of mapping of concrete domains onto the abstract ones. We talked about cognitive processes before, so this where these metaphorical processes come back. Yeah, so you have very common spatial, temporal, and modal pathways, and we see that in grammaticalization throughout the world. So there is certain mechanisms that can predict grammaticalization because it goes one way, thanks to that. Yeah. So, for instance, as I said before, the body terms become relational markers and so forth as an onset of grammaticalization. Yeah. Yes. Okay. So this. Would you like to talk a little bit more about metaphorical processes? They are quite fun, I think, because they are culture dependent. Yes, and that's also, you can kind of also see a change that happens across languages because our metaphorical mapping, what we have is culture dependent. Yeah. Like you kind of have, you know, just this proverbs, you know, that you might tell me in Portuguese that I will not necessarily be able to follow in Polish because we have different ones. So it's different mapping of different things. And if there is grammaticalization happen, it will follow that specific mapping that you might have or I might have as different speaker or different culture. Please, next. Then metonymic processes. Okay, so metonymy is generally yes. So it's generally shift. It's kind of like, you know, just like you might use a part of something to denote the whole thing or other way around. So, for instance, for the word king, I might use the word crown. So I'm picking one part of you know, just what a king is, and I'm just like one, how to say this, part of a whole, and I'm using this to denote the king. So I say the crown is blah, 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 instead of using the king. That's a metonymic process. You can kind of have different types of metonymic processes, but I'm not gonna discuss them today. But I can give you examples of grammaticalization that follow those metonymic processes. They are not metaphorical, but they are metonymic. So for instance, in French, chez, you can use chez lui, at his house, and this is generalized as a preposition at. Yeah. So him as a person, his house, so the part whole metonymic process that might grammaticalized. Yeah. We also kind of see this process, I think, in much more, in greater aspects, like when you talk about a head of a community. Yeah, a head of the community. In many of the indigenous languages from around here that I know, you can use the head as a leader of a community. This is also a metonymic process. Yeah, so from a body part, which is a concrete noun, through the leader. Yeah, and that can grammaticalize further as well. Yeah, so this is a kind of a pathway that it takes, that grammaticalization takes, that might change something in the language. Yeah. But interestingly, as metaphor and metonymy, it's very much culture dependent. Because when we talked about these cognitive motivations, well, cognitive motivations are universal in sense of we all look for concrete into abstract, all human beings. I mean, it's something much more universal. Those metonymic and the metaphorical processes are much more culture dependent, therefore can cause different grammaticalization paths. Yeah? Okay, next, please. Okay. It's quite interesting because sometimes, like, you know, just at the beginning when it was being talked about grammaticalization, at the beginning, somebody noticed that the word to, true, and to are related in a sense, you know, that they share this homonymic relations, that they sound the same, and it turned out that, sure, they are similar, like, you know, just their grammaticalization paths are similar, but they are only similar within the Indo-European linguistic family. For instance, you can have the paths of obligation, you know, just like you have to do something or you should do something. The grammaticalization of the verb should, if you go back in the history of English or Proto-Germanic, you're gonna get to the form of schuld. Schuld means the guilt. Yes, so I should do something is that I'm guilty of doing something. I feel obliged to do something. Yeah. So the same kind of thing. I mean, if you look at should across different languages, not Indo-European, you will see that the grammaticalization path is different. Yeah, it's not necessarily comes from a guilt, but for the Indo-European languages, it does. Yeah. The idea here was that they are homonymous. Yeah, so they have to come from the same source. Yeah. Now, it turns out that in the European languages, they do come from the same source, but it doesn't mean that across languages you're gonna have the two at position being derived from two forms like that. Yeah. So yeah. So it turns out that some of them will be cross-linguistically valid. So there is some connection, yeah, between directional to and recipient to. In other languages, not in the European, but around the world, there is a relation directional recipient. So you would have the direction to the recipient to, yeah, so that to, yeah. But they are in fact polysemous. You are talking about different polysemy of to. Yeah. So what I want to kind of draw your attention to, which I think, you know, just is quite important for describing, you know, just looking at grammaticalization from the indigenous perspective, is that we don't have those records. Like, you know, just for languages where all those records exist, you can go back, you can kind of find out what's polysemy, what's not. The whole reason that those three things are written in the different way shows their historical origin. Yeah, but in many of the languages, there is that indigenous languages, you will have just one form of to. You're just going to write it in the same way because you don't have that historical change of orthographies. So it's very much tempting to kind of think that if to is written with tu, tu, yeah, that it's very tempting to say that they are homonymous. Yeah, or they are the same source and then grammaticalized into different ways. Yeah, so for languages and written records where you can kind of see that two is just three different tools, in fact. Yeah, for languages that we don't have them, it's tempting to make those kind of generalizations that might not necessarily be right. Yeah, please, next. Okay, yeah. So generally, like when it comes to grammaticalization, one should discuss, you know, just this idea of one form, one meaning. Yeah, this optimality theory, you know, that just talks about the language where you would ideally have one form, one meaning, but this works for artificial languages. It doesn't work for normal human languages because it's too much information in our brain to consider. Therefore, we get those polysemous items in the language or homophonous items in the language that kind of allow us to remember all those different forms, but tied to one specific meaning or other way around. Yeah. So this is like this optimal. So this kind of idea, one form, one meaning, is not feasible for a human brain. Therefore, we associate forms that are similar to similar meanings. Yeah. Therefore, we develop polysemies. Because those things, in the first place, involve polysemies, it's not surprising that grammaticalization will also involve polysemies. Yes? That's one thing, that why some existential and locational phrases just can be similar, because they are similar to start with. Yeah? Please, next. Yeah, we talked about polysemies, so please, next, maybe. Let me see how much time we have, because I prepared a long talk. Maybe next. Maybe we can skip the maxims. Please, next. Yeah, like I talked about the maxims before. Do you guys remember? There's the maxims of quantity, maxims of quality, relevance, and manner. That is important, you know, just for the speech production and problem solving, understanding what somebody is trying to say. And that's where grammaticalization might start once this is misinterpreted. Please, next. So maybe this is not. Yeah.
please not. Well, next. Yeah, maybe next. Sorry. I want to go to something interesting because this is all theory. Please next. Let me see. Okay, yes. Next, so maybe we can kind of talk about this metaphorical process and metonymic processes, because I'm sure that you're going to have a lot of examples from your own fieldwork as well. Those things are very much culturally dependent. And like when you work with grammaticalizations, I kind of wonder if you're going to have this. Because many times, just what linguists do, they kind of describe grammaticalization saying, hey, there is this form becoming that form, it's being grammaticalized. But, sometimes it's quite nice to kind of think, just where those things might come from. Yeah. Please, next. Okay. So when we talk about grammaticalization, this kind of process of metaphorical and metonymic, just associations, they belong to the early stages of grammaticalization. Yeah. So grammaticalization has many stages. We kind of start, just with this metaphorical metonymic processes. Yeah. And any kind of innovation in the language, they start with meaning extension. Yeah, we've seen this kind of increases of polysemies in the meaning. Yes, so the speakers use an existing word, but they use it in a new sense. Yeah, and this kind of creative usage of new sense. Yes, they mostly happen through metaphor and sometimes through metonymy. Yeah, so this metaphor is like what we discussed before. That's something very important, and metonymy as well. So that's why this being creative when it comes to grammaticalization to start, this is what where it comes from. Yeah. So like look, for instance, at this verb to go, first the motion verb extension, just from this concrete into more abstract way, but it's used metaphorically for future because you're going towards, you're going away, yeah? So that's why this kind of metaphorical extension. Yes. It can be also in terms, like in addition to metaphorical extensions, you might also have metonymical extension in sense of reinterpreting the new word in the new context. Yes. Yes, and this is what we talked about before, right? We have the head and the leader of a community, yeah. But those two, very important when it comes to this early stages where the whole grammaticalization starts. Yes. Okay. Please next.
Metaphor and metonymy, they are especially relevant in the case of classifying systems or class term systems in Amazonian languages, right? I mean, for Apurina, you get both metaphors and metonymy when you get plain parts or body parts mapped onto other, and the properties of other elements, some based by shape, texture, consistency, but also part-whole relationships.
Mm-hmm. You can kind of see this like when it comes to the classification of many, like if there is a classification system, nominal classification of some sorts, you see this a lot. So for instance, I like not talking about South America, but the Indonesian languages, you can kind of see the tail, which is a classifier for animals, or fruit being a classifier for plants. So this kind of metonymic extension that give rise to classifiers that grammaticalize and become classifiers. Very much so. Or like gender distinctions as well. For instance, in some Australian languages, you can kind of have, just for things that are that you can drink, there is a, I think, like specific type of water, like sap from a tree or something, that is just grammaticalized into gender as well. So you have those as well, like everywhere, like when it comes to the classification system. And I think it's really beautiful, like in Carijona as well, those postpositions that are used, like being on the water, being in the liquid thingy, like liquid, like the postposition that is used, like if you are on a liquid surface. So yes, so this is very important. And I think, as I said, it's really crucial when it comes to the beginning of grammaticalization, not just to describe the form, but kind of try to interpret the meaning where it comes from, and what would be the metonymic, the metaphorical extension for something to start happening. Yeah, that's why I'm talking about this. Yes. And then something that we also saw before, just this kind of remapping, yes? So we kind of have something in our brain that is mapped that way. It might be concrete, a spatial object or like space, right? And then it's being remapped. Yeah, that's why when we talked about reanalysis, and that was a very good question that you asked, just where does the semantic change happen? Right at the beginning, because you have the remapping of the remapping of the understanding how something is put in your brain. So it's right at the beginning. The semantics is right at the beginning. You need to remap it first. Yeah. The semantics goes initial stages of reanalysis before even morphosyntax, yeah, or syntax. Now, and as I said, very important to kind of talk about polysemies, because once the grammaticalization, the early stages of grammaticalization takes into process, you kind of get this polysemous meanings, yeah, where you have the old and the new meaning that coexist, and they have to coexist. And maybe someday one will win and the other will not. Maybe two will keep in existence, but there will be polysemous. And now the question is, how many of those polysemous meanings will be? Because look, for instance, at this S in English, such as it, or the possessive, kashas, so this S, it has many different meanings. And, like, I don't know, that apostrophe S, in English. So it has different, like at least 6 different type of meanings. So, just the grammaticalization went the different ways, depending on the polysemy of the original meaning of to be. Yeah. Now, so you kind of have this, right? You have this metaphor, metonymy, you have this remapping of that metaphor, right? And then you have this polysemous, and only after all of those things take place, you kind of have the routinization that we talked about, yeah? So this frequent use of a given expression, yes? And then it becomes bleached and eroded phonologically and morphologically, yeah? So then you kind of talk about later stages of grammaticalization, but think about those that we just discussed: metaphor, metonymic, remapping. So again, metaphor, and then polysemous stage before everything else takes place. Please, next. Yes. So we talked about the bleaching before, yeah. But Hopper and Traugott, they're actually not talking about losing. Yeah, we are not talking about loss of the original meaning and something much more concrete becoming, I don't know, general, bleached. The meaning is not the same. The meaning kind of is lost. They're actually just talking about pragmatic enrichment and strengthening of the meaning rather than the loss of the meaning. Yeah. Because at the early stages of grammaticalization, we talked about polysemy. So there is a new meaning added to that given word that later becomes generalized. Yeah, so you're actually talking, if you think about it, you're talking about strengthening of the meaning rather than the loss of the meaning when it comes to bleaching. Yeah, so you're talking about the shift in meaning, not loss. Yeah, and that bleaching, generally bleaching, it will become later. So after the metaphor, after, you know, just this, what is it, metaphor and metonymic processes, remapping, routinization, all of those stuff, semantic bleaching will be later. Yeah. Okay, please next. And that thing that we just, like I opened, you know, just this talk about, like one of the things that I talked about is this kind of idea of persistence. Yeah. So we kind of have traces, not trances, traces of original meaning that tend to remain. Yeah. And this is very common. Even if we have something that's highly grammaticalized, there is still something that reminds us where it comes from. And I kind of like that idea from a West African language, where you can kind of see that that this ke that comes from the verb to give, yeah, or to take. Sorry. So she took book down, yeah, meaning she put. But this take, because like when you take something is affected, something is moved, something is put into emotion, right? It's volitional. It's so it's still it became an accusative marking, yeah, from the verb to take becomes an accusative marking now, and we can still see this kind of affectedness of the object that is taken. Yeah, we can still see it in the way it grammaticalized. Yeah. I didn't put the last translation of like what it's supposed to be, but so the idea generally is that synchronically in Ga, and synchronically what you see is that this accusative marker that comes from take, yeah, something that is affected object, you can use it for certain types of verbs, the one that are being affected. So for instance, if I take water, then I will have to use the accusative ka. I took the water, I don't know, I moved the water, whatever. But I did something physically with the water, it's being affected. Now, if I lay an egg, if I'm a chicken, or I try to just something, I try to do something in which the ONP, so the object NP, doesn't get affected, in which the egg is being laid. It's not me who's doing that on purpose, who's affecting the object. Then you cannot use the accusative marking. So the idea of this persistence is important here because that original ke will show the behavior, will show some traces of what it used to be and how it behaves in the grammar. Yeah. Please next. And we got to unidirectionality. Okay. We're going to start unidirectionality, and maybe we're going to finish tomorrow with some counter examples of grammaticalization, because this is what I promised to you. So let's start with unidirectionality. I might just go a little bit quicker. Do you remember what this unidirectionality hypothesis was? Very important in grammaticalization. Generally, things become from more lexical into more grammatical. Yeah, it goes into one line. And that line is not reversible. Yeah, so it's always more lexical, more grammatical. I don't know, lexical item, you know, just affix, suffix, but it doesn't go back. Yeah, that's that hypothesis of unidirectionality. And as Gabi said at the beginning, there are examples of examples showing that unidirectionality is only a hypothesis because they are counterexamples. In some, very few examples exist that show that there is grammaticalization, or as some people will call degrammaticalization, from a suffix becoming a clitic, or a suffix becoming a lexical word, against unidirectionality. Please, next. Yes, so as I said, grammaticalization is the prototypical unidirectional phenomenon. Yeah. From the diachronic perspective, we have discussed unidirectionality in terms of generalization, yes, so in terms of the process of a more concrete into more general, decategorization in terms of, becoming, like, changing the category from the more specific into more general, increase in the grammatical status of a lexical item, right, and renewal, so reusing a certain construction, yeah? And then from the synchronic point of view, we always talk about layering. Like when we discuss grammaticalization, you're gonna have different constructions for the same, with the same meaning, yeah? Please, next. Okay, and once we have a process of grammaticalization that starts, yes, there is certain paths that we can predict that might happen in the grammaticalization, and they are cross-linguistically valid. General, like when you look at unidirectionality, this is important here, is that it is the process that it's not any lexical item becomes grammatical, but what's very important is that it is a lexical item used in specific linguistic context. Yes, and that part is very important that some people forget, like they think, they say, okay, well, this item grammaticalized because of this. No, it was a very specific item used in specific linguistic context, such as, for instance, that we had this be going to, that was going used in motion senses, yeah? Motion verb, direction verb. So this part is important, specific context, yeah? Now, then syntax, morphology, and it becomes like lexical, then syntactic, and then morphology. So you kind of have the constructions that become syntactically fixed, such as be going to becomes fixed, and then morphologically fixed, gonna. Yeah. So we've seen that. Please, next. Okay, we talked about bleaching as well. We talked about metonymy, and I kind of wanted to point to this fact that meanings that tend to grammaticalize, they are quite general, yeah? So you're talking about hyperonyms, so the basic word that grammaticalize rather than specific words, yeah? So, for instance, generally what you might expect from the grammaticalization path is if we have, I don't know, a classifier developing for, or gender marker developing for the class of plants, it will be the hyperonym that is used. Yeah? Hyperonym plant that might be used as a classifier, for instance, like in Asian languages, in Vietnamese, for instance. You don't expect those specific items to grammaticalize for the whole class of plants, if those exist in the language. I mean, I'm just making things up, but generally that's the idea. The general ones grammaticalize rather than the specific ones. However, there will be some examples, which is quite interesting to see, in which it is the very specific one that grammaticalizes onto the general ones, but it's mostly because of some other factors that happen in the language, happen first for this to occur. Yeah, I think there is an example of like in Old English, you had the word Hund, which was used for the dog. Yeah, there was the word Hund, and Hund was this general word used for compounding and so forth. Now, at some point, there was the Scandinavian word, like when the Normans came. It was like when this yeah. So when there was a conquista, what is it called? Like, just like the conquista, I don't know. Like when the Scandinavians came and attacked, just the English, the English borrowed the word dog. So this is not an English word. In Old English, the word dog was borrowed. And then that word Hund, yeah, the original word for the dog was the meaning of it was narrowed. It didn't mean the dog anymore, but it meant a very specific dog. Yeah, so there was a change in meaning in which one would borrow the general meaning from another language. Yeah, that borrowed word became this, and the original word that was the general form went up here. So that change is also possible, but those are external factors that happen that cause this to happen. Yeah, but generally what we have those hyponyms that are used in grammaticalization. Yeah, please next. Yeah. So we can kind of skip this because this is the same thing for verbs such as go, walk. That's like an example from Latin to aller, from ambulare. That actually there are some examples where the more specific word becomes the more general word. But those are specific examples. So generally, for the unidirectionality hypothesis, is those general items. Please next. Okay. When it comes to the process of generalization that we talked about, there is two different ways that you can talk about semantic change. You can talk about broadening, and you can talk about narrowing. Yeah. So, this is that example that I wanted to show you. The word Hund in Old English, right? Then there is the Scandinavian dog that is borrowed, yeah? So this general word for the dog becomes narrowed, yeah, semantically narrowed, to mean a special type of dog, whether at the beginning it was the general term. So that's the narrowing, yeah? And this narrowing is quite interesting because it's tied to special the special semantic domains. Yeah, so that domain is mostly that has to do like with some kind of socially important concepts, such as, for instance, the taboos. Yeah, so look, for instance, the word mistress in English, yeah, originally meant the head of a household, yeah. But under the taboo and in the society that is not rid of the cultural implications, today mistress means a female lover, yeah. So that's the example of a narrowing in the domain of taboo. So those things, those narrowings, in addition, for instance, to some kind of, contact feature, like here, yeah, the Hund becoming a specific dog rather than the general. Those are the processes, social processes, cultural processes that help this narrowing. It's not very common, because generally what you have is the broadening in grammaticalization, not narrowing, yeah. But narrowing can happen, and those are examples of the narrowing. Yeah. Okay, please next. Okay. Now, okay. So we also kind of I gave an example, but I don't know if you remember. Let me see how much time we have. Okay, let me finish this slide on generalization, and we can continue tomorrow because I don't want to keep you going, guys. But the thing that sometimes you have so-called homonymic clash. Yeah, so we talked about narrowing. We have, just about broadening. You might also have a homonymic clash, which means that if there is a vowel shift, like it happened in English, like it happened in Indo-European languages for some language family, words under this shift of vowels might become similar. Although when it comes to the history of those things, they were not similar, but now they sound similar. Yeah, because they sound similar, we are talking about homonymic clash. We have two concepts that become to sound as one because of some kind of external sound change, for instance, and they cause dysfunctional ambiguity. Because there is a dysfunctional ambiguity, yeah, and they are homonymous, you might have processes of grammaticalization that happen because of that. Yeah. So, for instance, look at this example from French. You had the Latin word for gallus, yeah, which meant that beautiful roster here, and catus, which also meant that, yeah. But under the shift of the vowel that happened, yeah, they both, catus and gallus, became the word gut. Yeah. So we just have the word gut for both of them. And then because that happened, because we have now homonymous word, yeah, while there is two meanings of it, we have a homonymic clash because we have gut. Now there was a word or faisan introduced meaning this type of word. Yeah. So in order to avoid homonymic clash, you might have grammaticalization to take place. Yeah. So yeah. So I think let me just see the next slide so I can kind of finish the generalization. If I could look at the last one, the next one, please. Yeah. So please, the next one, so I can kind of finish generalization. Yes, okay. So tomorrow we're gonna continue with decategorialization, and I think we're gonna look at the structure of the clauses. Yeah, internal and external clauses. I will give you some examples, and I guess the day after we can talk about language contact. Thank you.